Welcome, Shari. I'm so happy to have you back. I think this is your second or third time. So thank you for coming back.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So I'm really excited to talk about the emotional legacy of narcissistic parenting and how to break those toxic cycles. But before we get started, I'm going to ask you what I've been asking everybody, and that is, what do you think most people get wrong about narcissists?
I think what most people get wrong is that when you're in a relationship with a narcissist, that you're the one that's wrong, you're the bad person in that situation. So I think narcissists are widely misunderstood by their victims because they don't understand that what the narcissist is doing is trying to push them down, break them apart so that they can somehow feel on top, have more power, and be the one that's in control.
And that keeps them stuck trying harder and harder to make it work with somebody who's not trying to make it work for them, at least, right? Yeah, I agree. Okay, so we're going to talk about the emotional legacy of having a narcissistic parent and the shame that children grow up with. And so, can you just share a little bit about that? Like, for people listening, what that looks like and describe it.
So I work with a lot of people in my practice who grew up in families where either the mom or the dad were narcissists, had narcissistic tendencies. What happens from very early in childhood is these types of parents are placing a lot of blame and shame onto their children. And when we're little and we're growing up, we think that if our parents are telling us that we're wrong, that we're bad, that we're unworthy, that must be the truth. So, from a very early age, what happens is your sense of self, your identity, it gets squashed. And in some ways, what the narcissist does is it takes the child's ability or their right to develop a sense of self, it takes that away from them. So, I think what happens is that as children grow up, they become teenagers and they become adults, they are walking through life. They're trying to form connections without any sense of self. They don't trust themselves. They don't feel worthy of being in a relationship where there's mutual respect, there's safety, there's boundaries. I could probably go on, but I think the impact is profound. And I think when I talk to people who grew up in these types of families, I think that the idea of coming from a place where there's narcissistic abuse, I still think even in 2024, it's minimized and it's still widely misunderstood just how toxic it can be and how harmful it can be, not only again to people when they're children, but in their lives moving forward.
The narcissistic parenting can be the gift that keeps on giving because it reverberates. If you don't heal those wounds, if you don't help yourself rebuild your identity or build an identity, if you've never really been able to have one, like growing up in a narcissistic parent household, then, like you said, then it affects everything as you grow older. And people start to get into relationships. I love the way that you said that without really having a sense of themselves. I don't know if you want to share any like examples of people that you worked with or whatever, but what does that look like? Because I know people out here, they try to choose somebody. I hear this all the time, like they were very intentional and tried to choose somebody who wasn't like their narcissistic parent. And then a couple months in, maybe longer, they realize, oh my gosh, I've picked somebody who makes me feel exactly like my narcissistic parent, even if they aren't similar, appearingly similar.
Yeah, I was just talking to someone in session about this, how he was talking actually about his sister, and he came from a family, or he comes from a family where his mom was very narcissistic, and his sister's also very, I would say, wounded from having grown up in that family, but has many of the same traits as his mom. And she just got into another relationship. And we were talking about how in the beginning, when she was dating this guy, he seemed so likable and charming. My client was saying in the beginning, I really liked him. He was super friendly. He seemed like he really cared about my sister. Fast forward to now, we're in year 2 and they just got married. And he was telling me about the wedding and how it as if she wasn't even at her own wedding. The focus of the ceremony was on him, the husband. Everything that people talked about was focused on him. He said my parents weren't allowed to toast my sister, which again, that doesn't make any sense. And him and I talked about this. She has not really done the work to understand her relationship with her mom. She still has work to do from her first marriage. And there are many things about this guy that is different from her first husband, but yet there are many things that are the same. So I think it's so important to understand that when you come from a family where there was narcissistic abuse, a lot of times people don't even know that's what happened. They don't even know that's what it's called. We have one childhood, right? So we think the way we grew up was normal. So for many of us working through recovery, one of the hardest parts is being able to identify and know just because they were my parents doesn't mean that they did the right thing or that they were good people. A lot of us, I think, spend years of our lives trying to fight from knowing the truth because we don't want to think our own parents could also be narcissistic, or now I have to say I'm a survivor of narcissistic abuse. There's so much shame around that. But the reality is that if we can move the shame to the side and say, the truth is, I came from a family where my mom was narcissistic. If we can own that, and then we can work on understanding how deeply that has affected us, then we won't be like my client's sister, who's going to go from marrying one narcissistic abuser to now what it sounds like another one. And again, this is somebody who's our age. She's in her 50s and still repeating those patterns. And it's very hard to watch that. And it's very hard to see that. But from what I was saying to my client, she just isn't ready to accept how she was parented, and she's not really ready to own her experience. So she's just going to keep doing the same thing over and over.
I think it's such a good point. So it's very difficult, like you said, to own it, to own what happened, to acknowledge that your parents were that way. And then growing up in that type of system, you're used to not really feeling your feelings. You're doing everything to not feel them. So how do you help people feel that? Because you have to feel your feelings. You have to, right? All those avoidant sort of behaviors and coping behaviors that help you get through, you sort of now need to do them differently so that you can get in touch with that and not repeat the patterns. But you want to talk about that a little bit, about how that's done. And
yeah, and this is, I think, one of the hardest parts, because when you come from a family where you're made to feel like your feelings don't matter, they're wrong, they're not worth hearing, we as the victim or the person who's dealt with that pathology don't trust ourselves. We question everything that we think and feel. So the first step, I think, after you name it and understand the pathology and where you come from, is to learn how to reclaim your right to trust yourself and your instincts. When you grow up in this type of family, you feel that maybe it was me, maybe I'm just overreacting, or I don't want to admit that this is how I feel because I don't want to hurt the other person's feelings. So I think it's really about reclaiming our right to honor our feelings, trust them, and be able to express them in a situation where, when we're in a close relationship with someone, you want to be able to say to the other person, this is how I feel, this is what I think. And in order to be able to communicate our feelings to others, we have to be able to trust ourselves first, or we're going to question and undo everything that we're trying to say.
And that is, I think, the biggest struggle, right? Like the questioning and then the undoing. How do you help your clients learn to trust themselves when they feel something, right? And know that it's valid?
What I try to do when I'm talking to somebody who's trying to state their feelings, and then when he or she or they start going, maybe it was me, maybe I did something wrong, I'll stop them and say, let's look at what you're feeling right now. And if you stick with what you're feeling and you don't try to disown it or dismiss it, what's the worst thing that will happen? Is that person going to be mad at you? Is that person going to tell you that you're wrong? So what I do is I try to intervene, and then I try to help people tap into their inner coach to say back to yourself, my feelings aren't wrong. We don't make up what we feel. We get to decide what we do with our feelings. We have control over that piece, but we don't have control over what we're feeling. If we help you to own your feeling and say, it's my feeling, and I know that I don't have control over it and I'm not making it up, what choices do I have moving forward? But it's so important to be able to honor our feelings. Many of you listening probably came from families where you were told you can't say that, you shouldn't feel that. How could you say that? To be able to talk back to that part of ourselves that was made to feel wrong, and then sit in that feeling and honor it, so that when we start expressing it to other people, we then don't take it back and try to undo the whole thing.
I was telling you earlier, this one thing I really loved about the book that you wrote, which is called Stolen Childhoods, From Surviving to Thriving. One of the things that I really loved about it is that you talk about your experience, your own experience. You share your own experience in therapy and how that therapeutic relationship was so vital to your healing. And it's not really talked about, but for for relational trauma, the way that we heal it is in relationship. And what you were describing about how you help validate your clients' feelings, that's what we do. I don't know how anybody would do it on their own, really, right? You want to share a little bit about maybe what you talk about in your book, and then speak to that.
Yeah, I think it's so important, again, for people who've been to therapy, when you're in therapy with a therapist that you feel safe with and that you feel like you can trust, you're going to have a different experience in that relationship than you've had with other people. For me, and this is something I try to model with my clients, the idea that there were boundaries in our relationship and that there was a respect, a mutual respect, that I never felt like she's my therapist, so she is has more power than I have, or she knows more than I have. I don't feel that way with my therapist, and I think that's really important. And then to be able to have all the feelings that come up in our daily lives: anger, jealousy, shame, guilt, sadness, depression, for some of us, suicidal ideation, to be able to bring that into my relationship with Dorothy, my therapist, that was her name, to be able to bring that into the relationship and have her react differently than other people had in my life growing up, was so healing. Because then I would sit there and go, oh, wait a minute, this is what it feels like to be cared about. She's not trying to fix it. She's not telling me I'm making it up. She's also not telling me that I can't work through it. She's not trying to take my feelings and be the hero in the situation. She's making a space in the room so I can express and work through my feelings. And then at the end of the day, walk out of that session, or at the end of that week, however long it would take me to work through the feelings, to be able to go, I just did that. Like, I spoke it, I felt it, I felt heard, I felt understood. It was such a feeling of joy and victory to be able to have therapy with somebody where I could have that experience over and over. And that's something that I try to help my clients with in our relationship, but also in their relationships with their partners, their bosses, their best friends, whoever it is that they're trying to have a safe and healthy connection with. That is so healing, because then you can go, oh, that's the difference. There's a difference here. And to be able to know what the differences are. I used to leave therapy and I used to write down, how do I know that this is different than the relationship I had with my mom, for instance, who I felt was very narcissistic? Would write the list down and go, I felt this, I felt that, I saw this, I noticed that. To be able to do that and then ask myself, which would I rather? Would I rather feeling how I felt with my mom, or do I feel like I would rather feel what I feel with Dorothy? And of course, what I felt with Dorothy would always win, because I felt empowered. I felt whole. I felt, like I said, I felt heard. I felt accepted and understood, even when I knew she didn't fully understand everything that I was saying. I knew that she understood enough that I felt like a whole person. And then I would say to myself, that's what I want. That. And then what I tell people is, if you have what you want in our relationship, the goal of our work is to then help you find that with everybody else. That's why therapy is amazing, because it teaches us how to take what we get in that relationship and bring it into our lives with our kids, our
Yeah.
parents, our partners, whoever it is that we're trying to have a relationship with.
It reminds me, like one of my clients was saying to me, and this is exactly it. It's so powerful that her relationships with her children are so much richer because of the therapeutic relationship and being able to practice some of the things that we do and then translate it into her work life. And a lot of times I think people overcorrect. So as a child, if your parents were narcissistic and you were always feeling in pain, emotional pain, you will then might overcorrect with your children and then not want them to be in any pain. So anytime that your children say something, you just want to fix it. That could be the overcorrection, but you don't notice it because you are operating from that really wounded place of, I know what it's like to be in pain and I don't want my child to feel that. A lot of those insights and becoming aware of those type of things that you might be doing from your unhealed places, your core wound, is so important to the process. Do you have any examples or want to share a little bit about that and your process?
I mean, I think it's one of the most important parts. And when you're talking about when we become parents and having a different relationship with our children, I feel like that's probably been the most healing part of my journey, to be able to step into a role of parent and say, I'm not going to do the same thing that was done to me. And to be able to be very aware when I feel like I could be slipping into those tendencies, to be able to parent differently than we were parented, to be able to make space for our children to be seen and heard, to be able to know that we're human and that we're not always going to do everything. It's a gift that we can give to ourselves, I think, to be able to say, even though I came from a very abusive background, I still want to be a parent and I want to do it differently. To be able to watch ourselves do it and to experience what it feels like to be a parent and to watch your child grow up in a childhood that wasn't stolen. I don't think it gets any better than that. Honestly, I think that's the biggest victory.
It really is. It really is. So, do you have a strategy or a first step? So, people listening to this who recognize themselves or maybe feel like the example that you shared with your client's sister, no matter how hard they tried, they're repeating these patterns and same types of relationships over and over, just different person. What would you suggest just to get started to move forward and out of this cycle?
So I think the first step is to be able to let ourselves know the truth about where we come from. And in doing that, to remember that if we let ourselves know the truth and we are able to acknowledge and admit that we come from families where we dealt with narcissistic abuse, that doesn't make us bad people. That doesn't mean that we're betraying our parents. It's not wrong. What it means is that you're taking ownership of the life that you're living now and the childhood that you come from, and you're making space to have a different life for yourself moving forward. A lot of times when people start to admit, oh, I think my mom might be a narcissist, many of my clients go into feelings of, oh, I can't believe I'm saying this. I hope you don't think badly of me. I don't want you to think badly of my mom. I always say to people, pathology is pathology. It's not something that is our fault. And there's certainly nothing wrong with being able to say your experience. You're clearly talking about what happened. You're not trying to hurt other people. You're trying to save your own life and you're trying to have a better life moving forward. So I think that's the most important step, is really being able to understand that if you let yourself know the truth, you're not hurting anybody else. You're only helping yourself. So to be able to talk to people about that, and again, this is not something we can do in a session. It's an
Mm-hmm.
ongoing theme that we need to continue to repeat to ourselves over and over. Even if you have to write it down like 50,000 times, I am not a bad person for letting myself know the truth about where I come from.
You're right. There's so much guilt. There's so much shame to speak negatively about anybody in the family. You learn to, it's your fault, right? It's something bad with you. And I also share too with my clients that a lot of times they have the what I call the adult self that'll come in and then have so much compassion for the parent, right? Because of their parenting. And I'm like, that's wonderful. That is your resilient, healthy adult self coming in. And we love that part of you that's gotten you through. But let's put them aside for a second, because we can still have compassion, but first we need to have compassion for ourselves, right? And the impact that we experienced as children, that child self needs to be acknowledged and heard and listened to. And before we can go on and have the compassion, it's a process, and that doesn't happen in a day or a week.
And I think what you're describing right now is inner child healing, to be able to take care of the younger part of ourselves that felt so hurt and so at fault and so wrong and bad and unworthy, in order for us to be able to go out in the world and have a different experience with other people, or even to be different types of parents than the parents we had. We need to really constantly be addressing that younger part of ourselves that will get triggered in different situations, and to be able to go, oh, the younger you didn't deserve to be made to feel like that. That's not okay, and that should not have happened. And it's not your fault. You are not the cause of someone else's pathology.
No, absolutely not. And so let's talk a little bit about shame, because there's so much shame. And shame is really one of those emotions that is hidden from ourselves often. So do you want to talk a little bit about the shame that comes from being raised in narcissistic families?
Yeah, and I hate that word and I hate that emotion, but I also know it's an emotion that everybody in the world has experienced. When I think of shame, I think the shame becomes the protector to the truth. If we think we're horrible people, maybe this world would be better off without us. What we're actually doing is we're taking responsibility off the person that caused us harm, and we're making it our fault, which for many of us feels safer. We make it our fault, then nobody else gets in trouble. We don't have to feel bad about saying bad things about other people. The problem with shame is that it's crippling, it's debilitating. We're not able to take action and make changes if we're stuck in like the muck of shame, which is really the way it can feel. You can become paralyzed when you feel like you shouldn't be here. The world would be better off without me. I'm so ugly. I'm so this. I'm so that. Those kind of self-hateful thoughts don't allow us to go out into the world and have healthy relationships, to get better jobs, to do what we want to do in our lives. So I always say to people, as they understand shame more and the role that it has, I try to help people understand that it's a horrible feeling, but it's also a defense mechanism. I'll say a lot to people, if you weren't feeling shame, what would you be feeling? And in most cases, they say, I'd be mad. I'd be mad at my mom. I'd be mad at my dad. If we grow up in a family where we get hurt for being mad, we don't feel safe to feel mad. So in order to let go of the shame, we would have to be able to access the anger and then figure out how to feel it, to sit with it, and then to express it in a way that isn't going to cause more damage to ourselves or to other people.
I've had clients who then are able to access the anger. It comes out in like a very over, right? Because they haven't ever been able to practice managing anger. So it becomes, oh my gosh, people think I'm a rageaholic now. And then the tendency to put themselves down, right? Be critical of themselves for that, when you're just learning. You haven't had the experience.
If we weren't taught how to express anger, and if we were told that anger is bad, wrong, once we start feeling it and expressing it, we're probably going to come out and be attacking people, lashing out, and shame will cause that. A lot of times when I felt shame, I also felt rage. Those were the times in therapy I would just go off on my therapist and say all kinds of things that I wish I had never said, because I didn't understand. I didn't understand what was happening. I was still in the shame. And instead of feeling angry, I was feeling rage towards her, as if she was the one that hurt me, but she didn't do anything. Sometimes she said things that pissed me off, but that doesn't mean that she is trying to hurt me, right? So I think you have to give yourself grace. And if you're someone out there that's trying to learn how to be in your anger and to express it appropriately, it takes a long time to really figure out how to do it in a productive, helpful, actionable way that isn't going to cause damage in relationships. And that's where, again, I think therapy can be very helpful. Joining this today and sitting here and listening to this conversation today, there's steps that we can take to go, oh, all right, wait a minute. I just need to learn how to do this. I'm not a rageaholic. I just don't know how to do it. And to say to yourselves, if you want to learn how to express your anger productively, you're certainly capable, but give yourself a break. It's going to take time, and it definitely takes a lot of practice.
I guess when your therapist or somebody you trust or care about who cares about you back, validates you for that, that is super powerful, right?
That's another one of those experiences where you could say, as uncomfortable as I felt and as much as I hate feeling this feeling, that was hugely healing. And that's, again, that's a victory. That's you getting revenge against the abuser, because you're saying, doesn't matter how much you hurt me, I can still go out and live a life where I can have a different experience. So shame on you for what you did to me, but you're not going to continue to do that to me anymore.
So I want you to share about your book, because it's a great book. I got to read it ahead of time, and so thank you for that. And you share, it's really a book about how to heal. It has all different strategies. It's very in-depth, but it's very interwoven with a story and your story about therapy and how that helped you. And you have actionable steps people can take. So it's very comprehensive and a great resource. So I want you to share it for people listening to this who are resonating with what we're talking about today.
I think by the time this comes out, the book will have been formally released. The official launch is May 7th. And the reason I wrote Stolen Childhoods is because I really want people who are trying to heal from all types of childhood abuse to have a resource or examples, or, like you're saying, actionable strategies to combat some of the hardest and worst parts of thriving after abuse. It's definitely a process. And I think, again, the book, it was so hard to write because it meant that I had to go back and look at some of the worst and most painful parts of my own journey. And also, I talked a lot about my work with different clients. The reason I decided to put actionable strategies in the book was because I wanted people to see, as hard as this is to get through, here's the way you can do it. And here are some ideas or things that I've done or things that other people that I work with have done. So it's like an offering to anybody out here who's trying to figure out how to stay sane as they're working through years of abuse. I really wanted to also make sure I talked, and there's a whole section in the book on growing up with a narcissistic parent. I really wanted to make sure that was in the book because, again, like I said at the beginning, I feel like that type of abuse it's not really understood and often gets dismissed. So if you're someone out there that's going, my dad never hit me or nobody ever sexually abused me, the thing that I did in the book was I tried to help people to see it doesn't matter what kind of abuse was done to you. At the end of the day, abuse is abuse, and this is what it did to us, but these are the things that we can do to thrive, to heal, to have a different experience. So that's the theme or the reasoning behind the book. And I'm so, so excited about the book because I just think that there's so many people out here who came from families where they suffered from so much abuse and they don't know what to do. They don't know what it's called. They don't know how to cope. So I really hope it helps people. I hope it's like a guide for people and it's something that people can use as they're on their journey.
I know it will be. And I love that you put actionable strategies because I think it's nice to hear other people's stories of how they've overcome their own abuse, but people need steps. We need strategies. We need like a blueprint, a how-to, because it's not something that's going to be intuitive. I love that you've put that there for people. One last thing before we wrap up. I have a lot of clients who have suffered childhood trauma and they'll start to do really well and then they'll have some sort of setback they just don't feel like they'll ever get ahead of it. So for those people sitting, listening to us, can you share some words of wisdom with them?
I feel for people in that situation. Of course, I've been there. I have people every day saying to me, I can't believe I'm still talking about this stuff, or I can't believe I did that again. The backslides are really the opportunities for growth. If we are on our healing journey and we're just continuing to progress and we don't get triggered or we don't see ourselves repeating old patterns, how are we supposed to learn? You can't really learn. So it's to be expected. And I talk about this a lot when I'm in court now, because the judges are asking me similar questions like, is this something that you can be cured of? Is this something that ever goes away? You can't cure CPTSD. You can't cure the enormity, the impact of what was done to you as a child. It's imprinted in our hearts and our brains and our bodies. Instead of shaming ourselves, we can say, maybe I'm ready to face this part of my past, and maybe that's why this is happening. So I think it's important to reframe it, not look at it as you're defeated, because you're not. You're growing. Even in the backslide, you're still growing, because you're sitting here listening to this conversation right now, or they're sitting in your office with you having a session about it. So the most important thing I think out of in terms of like how to deal with the backslides is to just be open to reframing it and looking at it as another opportunity for healing.
Absolutely. And when you're feeling triggered, instead of thinking, God, why am I still getting triggered over this? It's the fact that you're noticing that you're being triggered, right? You're aware of your trigger, and then you can handle it. You can respond differently. That is huge. And some things we may always be triggered by, right? Like you were saying, they're just imprinted.
There's not a day that I'm on earth that I don't feel triggered by something. It's just part of the experience that I'm living, and it's the experience that my clients are living in. And sometimes I say to people, nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, "Oh, I hope I feel triggered today." But I believe that there's a part of our brain that is allowing ourselves to be triggered because we want to work through one more piece of our past. I just think that's part of how our brain works, and it's how we store trauma. When we're ready to look at different parts, either our brains, our hearts, or our bodies allow us to know something more. And then there's that opportunity again for growth.
So true. Our triggers really are the entry points into our healing, our healing our wounds. Thank you for being with me today and sharing. Is there anything that you'd like to say? And then also please share with everybody where they can find you and follow you and do all those good things.
What I want to say is that by showing up today and by sitting here and joining us in this conversation, that takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of strength to be able to sit and listen to things that could tap into your experiences. So you need to be proud of yourselves and honor yourselves for taking the time that you're taking to address this. And you're giving yourself more of an opportunity to heal moving forward. If you want to find me, you can come to my website, which is just sharibotwin.com. I'm on all the, as they call those, social media platforms. So Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. If you just look for Shari Botwin, you'll find me. If you want to order the book, and I'm very excited actually, because the book's also going to be in an audio book, and I got to be able to narrate the book. So if you want to order the hardcover, the Kindle, or the audiobook, just go to Amazon or wherever you buy your books, and hopefully you'll find it helpful. And if you want to reach out to me, my email address, you can email me, or you can, what do they call it? DM me? Is that how you call that?
DM you.
My teacher teaches me all this stuff. You can DM me on all the social media platforms. I will answer. So if you reach out, just know I'm going to answer.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Shari. Love having you here always.
Thank you for having me.